as we dive deeper into the EU, Ukraine, and the country's ethnic minorities. My name is Emese Latkóczy. I'm the Executive Director of the Hungarian Human Rights Foundation in New York. A few housekeeping things. Today we're going to be using the webinar format, which means that the attendees' mics and cameras are turned off. Therefore, we ask that you use the chat feature to post your questions, and you can be posting those continually. When we get to the Q&A part at the end, then my colleague will summarize any questions that are repetitive. So we're going to jump right into it. Our panelists today come from and are experts in the region of Transcarpathia in Ukraine. Dr. Viktória Ferenc is a professor, researcher, and she was recently elected to the European Parliament as a member of the Hungarian delegation. Dr. Sándor Seremet is a frequent lecturer, and he's the senior researcher at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade in Hungary. They are both currently in Budapest, and that's where they'll be joining us from. So I'd like to dive right in and ask my colleague to share a map of Ukraine so that we can orientate ourselves, get to know the lay of the land. And then I would ask Dr. Seremet to start us off by providing a brief overview about Transcarpathia and a rundown of Ukraine's smaller, lesser known autochthonous ethnic minorities. Dr. Seremet, the word is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity and for the kind invitation to participate in the panel. In the upcoming couple of minutes, I'll probably give you a little overlook on Ukraine's territorial composition and how this territorial composition affects its ethno-linguistic composition, the one that basically defines the minority and language policies of the country. The very first map that you see here, it dates back to the 1784. This is the time when Ukraine is divided between today's Ukraine, between the Russian Empire, the Polish states, Poland, Lithuania, and the tiny little part in the west, today's Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia, to the Austrian monarchy. This state was present until the division of Poland in the end of the 18th century. May I please have the next slide? From the end of the 18th century until the beginning of World War I, the majority of Ukrainian territories were under Russian control, and then the rest on the western parts was part of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, with the division that today's Galicia was part of the Austrian element of the monarchy, yet Transcarpathia was part of the Hungarian kingdom. Please, next slide. This map shows the territorial evolution of Ukraine. The vast green territories are the core Ukrainian territories that were evolving under Russian control. The western yellow parts coming from Polish territories after World War II, Transcarpathia on the very west. The brown parts come from Romania during the World War II agreements between the Soviet Union and Romania. And the very last part, the purple Crimea Peninsula, that was connected to Ukraine in 1954 due to some administrative resolutions in order to make the rebuilding and reconstruction of the region more frequent and easy. Keeping in mind these historical perspectives, how the Ukrainian state was, or today's Ukraine was basically built by various territories, allows us to understand better how the ethno-linguistic composition of the country was built later on. Please, next slide. Over here you can see the map where you can see the ethnic distribution of the country depicted. The very red one is the Ukrainian majority, which more or less reflects the core territories of the Ukrainian ethnic majority, with other colors where we can see various languages that are being spoken in the country. not necessarily reflecting the actual ethnic composition. For example, if you look at the brighter yellowish parts on the south of Ukraine, we can see that this is predominantly Russian-speaking territories, which is true, but if we would have a look from the ethnic point of view, then it would be clearly visible that it is predominantly ethnically Ukrainian, yet the spoken language was Russian and to a certain extent is Russian as well. On the western part of the country, you can see that little green stripe, which is the Hungarian language territory, where predominantly Hungarian is being spoken. Yet the little purple dots and gray dots reflecting the Romanian parts of the compact Romanian ethnic groups living. We will get to this a little bit later because the Romanian language is a little bit tricky in Ukraine because certain parts of the Romanian language is being considered Romanian, in other parts it is being considered as Moldovan, which is due to the later changes of the Moldovan constitution. Soon will be also considered as Romanian, but this is a different topic. Next slide, please. We know that in Ukraine there were no censuses done since 2001, so from that time on we have only estimates on the linguistic preferences of the country. This would be the official one that was performed more than 20 years ago in 2001, and here the very vast blue territories are describing where the Ukrainian language was said that it is a native or the original language spoken by the local population, where the red dots are the ones where the Russians consider that this is the Russian-speaking territory or the Russian native language territories within Ukraine. But if we look to a more, I wouldn't say realistic, but probably more precise linguistic map of Ukraine, may I please ask the next slide? Then you would see that the difference is a little bit more balanced, I would say, or nuanced rather than the one that you've seen before. We have the Ukrainian majority that is ethnically depicted in the map. We see the Russian majority over there, and the purple ones where we have very mixed population, not necessarily Russian-Ukrainian. This also can be Bulgarian, Romanian, or other ethnicities living in Ukraine. Next map, please. And this reddish and I don't know, yellowish brownish map shows the languages spoken at home. This is a very important map, I would say, because if you look at the data coming from the censuses, people tend to say that their native tongue or mother tongue is Ukrainian or Russian or Hungarian, whatever. But here the question was stated a little bit differently. What language do you use when you're speaking at home? In Ukraine, it used to be very typical to use bilingual approaches in languages. Many people consider themselves Ukrainian speaking, yet in many other cases when they are among friends or at home, they speak other languages that have more deeper cultural ties. For example, this is very typical in the region of Zakarpattia, where people are yet they say that they speak Ukrainian, but they speak the local mixture of Slavic languages, which is called the Transcarpathian dialect, for example, or use Hungarian or even Romanian. Next one, please. And this is the more or less recent poll that was taken in order to establish what are the most spoken languages in Ukraine. And you can see that on the borderlines of the western part of Ukraine, there are Polish, Romanian, and Hungarian languages that have been spoken. And the red ones are the ones that are predominantly Russian. Yet the spread of the Ukrainian language as the first and used languages is spreading way stronger than it used to be before. So if we take into account how the Ukrainian state evolved and how the ethnic composition of the Ukrainian state is developing, we have to take into account that Ukraine is a very diverse, multilingual and multi-ethnic country. And it used to be like that for a long time. However, due to the shock of the loss of territories like Crimea and the crisis in the Donbass, had a serious impact on the language policies of the country. You have to understand that language rights and language policies became not only a political thing, it also became a matter of state security. And from 2014 and on, the use of language became not only an element of the political influence or even electoral campaign, but it also was a matter of state security and integrity of the country. We have to understand this. This is a very complex matter and a very important element of the Ukrainian not only nation building but also state building. So when we are talking about the language policies that are being taken in Ukraine since 2014, we have to take into account that this is not solely a linguistically driven process, but also state security and state building driven process as well. So we have to understand when we are assessing this one. But during our conversation later on, we're going to have more detailed and more deep conversations on that. So I would conclude here and pass the word back to Ms. Emese. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Seremet. Could you just give us an approximation of what numbers we're talking about when we refer to these smaller, so-called lesser-known minorities? I know, like you mentioned, the last official census was in 2001, but basically, what's the range of numbers that we're talking about for Hungarian, Polish, Bulgarian?
Ukraine is a huge country with a significant population. So if we are talking about numbers, they might seem large. For example, there's around 400,000 Romanians, or in 2001, it was around 150,000 Hungarians. But if you look at the percentages, then it is way smaller, like 0.4% the Romanians, 0.3% the Hungarians, approximately 0.1 the Bulgarians. So the Polish are even smaller, but there is a interesting element in that, because when Poland became very attractive from point of view of economy or immigration to the Ukrainian population, then way more people started to claim themselves as Polish. So this rose the percentage to 0.9, if I'm not mistaken, over here. But these are really small fractures of the entire Ukrainian population, if you're talking about ethnicities. Yet in the regions where they're living, in those communities, they are significant. For example, in Transcarpathia, right, the 0.0% of the total population gives nearly 10% of the local population of that community. Same applies to the Romanians, where it can be even higher in the regions of Chernovtsi, or lower to the south in Bessarabia.
Right. Let's stay with you, Dr. Seremet, and please sum up for us the current Ukrainian legal framework governing the rights of national minorities in the country.
Well, Ukraine was contributed to all the EU frameworks that provide the national minority rights in terms of use of language in education and in the cultural sphere. But in my opinion, it is even more significant that Ukraine signed framework agreements on bilateral level with its neighboring countries such as Hungary and Romania, in which both of the parties committed themselves to provide all the necessary rights to their minorities vis-a-vis Budapest, Kiev, in order to have equal access to education, to cultural rights, to religious rights, press, and media. So basically, on paper, all these communities are provided with the rights that are the standard rights within the EU framework and also in the bilateral agreements. In 2017, there were slight changes proposed by the Ukrainian government that would restrict the use of languages in the education and in the media as well. It has to be doubled. but the actual implementation of these changes were scheduled to be performed in September 2024. Yet we know that by December 2023, certain changes in the Ukrainian legislation was taken in order to provide Ukraine the possibility to start the negotiations of the EU accessions. So these restrictions were taken out of the Ukrainian legislation. So this is a very fortunate situation, because it didn't happen that the rights were restricted and now they have to be given back. Simply the implementation of those that was scheduled to be done, like in September 2024, were not actually implemented. So it was done in the right time, I should say.
Thank you for that. We then turn to Dr. Ferenc and the EU specifically. Ukraine's relations are anchored in the European Neighborhood Policy and Eastern Partnership, which aims to strengthen its alignment with EU standards. The milestones so far have been applying for membership in February 2022, to recap, achieving the candidate status, and in December 2023, the European Council approved opening accession negotiations. First intergovernmental conference held in June 2024 launched the formal accession talks. I'd like to ask Dr. Ferenc to speak to the Copenhagen criteria, because we often hear this mentioned when it comes to minorities. How does that fit into the process? And namely, what specific steps has Ukraine taken to align its policies with the EU requirements?
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. I am really grateful for the opportunity to engage in this course on the subject of minority protection in Ukraine. As a member of the European Parliament, I consider the protection of national, ethnic, and linguistic minorities to be one of my primary responsibilities, especially because I came from that origin. I was born as a Transcarpathian Hungarian, and now I try to represent as such the minority rights in the process of Ukraine access to the European Union. So speaking about the Copenhagen criteria, because you mentioned them, it's a set of criteria require candidate countries to ensure stable institutions, guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and the respect for and protection of minorities. So it's for us a good set of requirements, and for the minorities, for the Hungarian minorities and other minorities in Ukraine can use them very well in this process. The most important step so far is that Ukraine's parliament adopted an updated draft law on national minorities in December 2023, so the end of last year. And according to the Ukrainian government, the amendments take into account the expert opinion of the Council of Europe and its bodies. So they were taken into account all the European views on the situations. And all the amendments in this new law were made to ensure that Ukraine meets the European Commission's criteria for opening EU membership negotiations. The national minorities itself living in Ukraine consider this new law to be an improvement compared to the restrictive legislative framework observed since 2015, 2017. But they add, however, that it is only a first step towards settling the discriminatory measures that have accumulated over the years. One of the most important organizations of the Transcarpathian Hungarians, the Transcarpathian Hungarian Pedagogical Association, has stated that the new law has not fully restored mother tongue education, but it has limited the subject that must be taught in the state language to certain subjects. However, the organization said that the issue of the use of the Hungarian language is in state vocational schools, technical colleges, and higher education remain unsolved. So national minorities waiting for further legislative steps to get back their rights and can live their life as a national minority in Ukraine with dignity. And their legitimate organizations are open for further negotiations to have a real good legislative framework for the protection of national minorities. Maybe I can add this answer for your question.
Right. Actually, yes, you hit upon a few follow-up questions on my part. So how could you tell us a bit more about, now generally speaking, the accession process, how Ukraine monitors, the EU monitors Ukraine's progress? Is there a rough timeline? What are the opportunities for the minorities themselves to actually engage with this process to make their needs heard?
Mm-hmm. Of course, I can highlight some important steps of this monitoring process, because the EU monitors Ukraine's progress on minority rights during the accession talks through a combination of mechanisms, reports, and regular dialogue. The monitoring process is designed to ensure Ukraine aligns with the Copenhagen criteria we were talking about earlier, which include respect for and protection of minorities. The protection of the rights of persons belonging to minorities is a fundamental value for the EU also, and it is enshrined in the EU's founding treaty. And respect for it is a condition for accession. The states wishing to become a member state of the EU must find solutions together with the minorities, and problems can only be considered solved if the minorities are satisfied. So it should be a mutual process from the side of the state and from the side of the minorities. The Commission representatives regularly consult with representatives of minorities in the candidate countries to ensure that the measures are effective. The European Commission also have different procedures concerning reports on Ukraine's accession process. And in these reports, the Commission reviews the progress of the country, including on minority rights also and the protection of fundamental human rights, and make further recommendations for the state, drawing attention to areas where further improvements are needed. Actually, next Monday, I will be present in the European Parliament, one of those reports, the evaluation of the report. So this is, in this way, the European Parliament also is in the process, because the Commission reports are also evaluated or also introduced before or in front of the members of the Parliament. We can also comment on this. The Council of Europe has different tools to monitor the process. Maybe it's the first time to mention the Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, and also the Language Charter for National Minorities. In this case, not only the states should submit reports from time to time to the Council, but also the national minority organizations has the opportunity to submit reports, and we call these reports as shadow reports. And both of the state reports and both the shadow reports are evaluated or are taken into consideration when the final evaluation is made.
And have there been shadow reports submitted by the Hungarian minority or the Romanian one that you know of? I know that you're Accession, but
yeah, the Hungarian minority is quite active in that sense, and not just because of this EU accession process, but before this process, the Hungarian minority submitted several times a shadow report on how they feel about about the state of their rights and how the rights are not just in de facto situation, the jure situation, not only speaking about the existing laws and rights of the minorities, but how they are in practice. So what is the de facto situation? And I think the shadow reports are the best solution for showing the functioning of different laws in everyday life. And it's a good tool for the national minorities to use it in giving feedback to the European institutions.
and so those are taken into consideration then. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe just one more comment that I think that also the fact itself that the Hungarian government has or gave us minority communities, not only the Transcarpathian Hungarian minority community, the opportunity to nominate one member of the parliament in their national list, but also for the Voivodian community. It's also a good, how to say, a good opportunity for the communities, because now the Transcarpathian Hungarian community has a kind of voice through my person, and also the Voivodian, the Serbian Hungarian community has a person, a representative in the European Parliament in the list of the Hungarian government. So I think it's also a good tool for the national minorities in order to make their voice stronger in the European institutions.
Right. Yes, I'd like to pivot back to 3 specific laws that affect the bedrock of cultural identity for ethnic minorities. And I know that there's been changes. Dr. Seremet alluded to these. And I would like to, I guess, start with Dr. Seremet, if he could address firstly, the law on national minorities. You already mentioned that it was modified in December 2023. And subsequently, the Venice Commission, if we could talk about it in the context of that, because that's another term that often comes up when we're talking about minorities. They had something to say about it as well.
Well, the very first law that was adopted was the Law on Education in 2017. And as it was mentioned before, it prescribed the gradual transfer from the national language used in the education to the state language. By the end of the school years, the majority of the subjects should be taught in the state language. Only the minority language, like Hungarian and Hungarian literature, for example, can be taught in the language of the minority. Well, this was the intention, and of course, this gives certain hiccups into the education system of the minorities in Ukraine. Since the problem was not that in the schools people have to speak these languages, but the problem was that the methodology of teaching these languages were not changed. Many times the Hungarian leaders and the community of the Hungarian teachers proposed methodologies how Ukrainian should be taught for Hungarian kids in the schools, in order that they can pick up these classes later on and subjects later on in the school if the law will be in place. However, these were rejected from moral points of view, since state language shouldn't be taught as a foreign language, for example. So the criticism towards this, first of all, meant that by restricting the use of minority languages in the education is a restriction of fundamental human rights, especially taking into account that bilateral agreements were signed between Budapest and Kiev in the early 90s, when the diplomatic relations and later on the strategic partnership was established between the two countries. So by implementing this law, the biggest problem was that yet it aimed to persuade the integration of the minorities to the Ukrainian, to broader Ukrainian society. It rather would lead to even further alienation of them, since with lower levels of chances succeeding in the so-called independent testing after the finishing of the schools, it was likely that the Hungarian kids will have lower chances to get to universities or higher education due to the lower marks in these exams. So it would lead to further emigration of the Hungarian minority outside of the country. Then the next laws that were implemented were about the ensuring of the use of Ukrainian as a functioning of the Ukrainian language as state language that would push the minority languages to the households and to the churches, meaning that the languages that are not being the state languages cannot be used in any official environments. They must be used only in the religious organizations and in the households, meaning that, for example, if someone travels to a city which is predominantly or there is a significant Hungarian minority lives, then someone would like to order a coffee in a bar or in a cafe where Hungarians live. The waiter should address the guest first in Ukrainian, and then on mutual agreement they can switch to Hungarian, for example. But again, this was on paper in many cases. So the ones who were more skeptical about these laws were saying that it's okay that the laws were adopted, but how the control and how the implementation of those will be performed. So what will be the staff who will monitor the use of the state language or use of the minority language, let's say in Transcarpathia or in Chernivtsi or in Bessarabia, Bukovina, where the Romanians are living. So again, there was a significant, in my opinion, political element into that. So the talks about the problems with these laws were way higher than the actual possibilities of implementation and monitoring of the implementation of these laws were. And I think the tendencies that we see now, despite the problems that remained and were addressed by the minorities, the tendencies are better, I guess. And if the necessary laws will be changed, and they are changing, and the EU and the Western partners of Ukraine will monitor in the proper way the implementation of these changes into the legislation, then I think that the overall situation can be improved. The other thing, which is a little bit concerning, that these changes are a little bit exclusive. So if we look deeper into the legislation back in the day, then there is a serious difference between the languages within the country itself. For example, certain changes can be used and implemented towards the languages that are being official in the European Union, yet other languages that are not. There, for example, for those, these changes cannot be applied. So this is another question whether this is an appropriate way to handle these problems or not. But from point of view of the Romanians and Hungarians, Bulgarians, Poles, for example, the situation may improve in midterm, I guess.
Okay, thank you for that. We had mention the bilateral context. So between, in this case, Hungary and Ukraine. They signed a basic treaty back in 1991. So both of you have addressed the requirements of those of that agreement, and I would ask how, in light of what the Ukraine's deputy prime minister, who was responsible for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, Olga Shepitsnaya, in June of 2024, she has said that we're sincerely committed to resolving and fully implementing those issues raised on the Hungarian side, which strengthen the protection of national minorities, as well as continue bilateral consultations with Hungary. So that's extremely positive. And I'm wondering if Dr. Ferenc, you could say anything about how those are proceeding and what role Hungary plays in the EU advocating for minority rights. A sub-question would be, are there any joint initiatives between Hungary and any other kin states?
Thank you for the question. From the outset, Hungary was among the foremost supporters of Ukraine, being one of the first countries to recognize the newly independent state in 1991. And the two countries in this year signed a bilateral agreement on good neighborhood relations, which entered in force between the two parties in 1993. This was a significant step forward in the relationship between the two countries, as it demonstrated a commitment to cooperation and mutual respect. The agreement outlined a number of key principles, including a commitment to refrain from making any territorial claims against each other, and a recognition of the importance of economic cooperation. The objective is to achieve these goals through the conclusion of mutually beneficial bilateral agreements. Furthermore, there is a need to encourage the use of the language of the other party and to ensure the mutual protection of the ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identity and of the national minorities living in each other's territory. In addition, all the necessary conditions must be created for this to occur. So Hungary has a fundamental obligation under the fundamental law to promote the well-being of Hungarians living abroad, including the Hungarians of Transcarpathia in their homeland. Since 2015, the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, as we were mentioned several times, has been subject to systematic restriction of its language and educational rights, what is completely contrary to the international principles of equal access and non-discrimination. These limitations on national minority education and minority rights in general are not in accordance with these previous agreements. Hungary has consistently protested against laws that curtail the rights of minorities, demanding that these rights are already acquired by national minorities and these should be not restricted. As a result, respect for minority rights is one of the most important aspects of the Hungarian perspective in the Ukraine assess process. Hungary's goal here is to achieve a legal framework for the Hungarians of Transcarpathia that is satisfactory to them, that meets the highest international standards and that promotes their well-being in their homeland. Hungary has indicated on several occasions that it is ready to give its full support to Ukraine's accession to the EU if these conditions are met. These conditions are built in 11 points of requirements which dealt with different aspects of education in the minority language, the use of national ethnic symbols, and the rights of using the language in different situations of minority people's life.
Actually, let's pivot to the Romanian minority, which Dr. Seremet had mentioned earlier. we know that the Romania's leadership at the very highest level has expressed its dissatisfaction with the extent of rights that their co-nationals have. And recently, an institution in Ukraine polled ethnic Romanians in the country about the Ukrainian government's approach to their cultural and linguistic rights. Dr. Seremet, if you're familiar with this, if you would sum it up for us, and I'd also be interested in the nature of relations between these smaller, what we refer to as smaller ethnic minority groups, Ukraine. Are they basically all on the same page as regards what their cultural and linguistic?
Well, it is not a simple yes or no question, or who's better, who's not. If you look at the history of the relations and reactions on the changes in the minority rights in Ukraine after 2014, then we can see a certain pattern over here. Well, when the first laws were adopted and announced that how they will affect the minority rights and minority language rights, all the neighboring states of Ukraine who have their co-nationals living in Ukraine, they addressed Ukraine with criticism about the actions that are being taken. Later on, I'm talking about matter of months, their position changed due to a broader geopolitical rationale, I would say, since it was explained to them that the main target of these changes are basically security matters rather than minority law matters, and actually, except of the Hungarian government, all the other governments actually stepped back a little bit from the criticism formulated to Ukraine. Later on, when the bilateral relations with the neighboring countries went through certain volatilities and they had their ups and downs, the element of this kind of criticism was used again. And Romania was actually the second country with the Hungarians, with Hungary, that formulated its criticism towards Kiev and its minority policies that affected the Romanian community as well. Why the Romanian and Hungarian communities are so sensitive towards this? Well, the thing is that if you remember the map that I was showing, that not like the other, or unlike the other ethnic communities living in Ukraine, these are the two communities that are living in very compact and very dense regions, densely populated regions, monoethnically populated regions within their regions, mostly close to the border, and by this, their level of integration with the majority Slavic population, with the majority of Ukrainians, is not that high. So it's very common that among Romanians and Hungarians, people don't really speak any Ukrainian. So for them, losing the opportunity to learn in the school and on their mother tongues is a serious loss and a serious problem. Unlike others, like the Poles, for example, or Bulgarians, who are speaking the language way better, and they are reflecting to their ethnic heritage more than rather a cultural than a practical way, right? So that's the difference of the Hungarians and Romanians from other communities living in Ukraine. So since there is at least 400,000 Romanians living in Ukraine, it's a significant community, so their voices must be heard. And Romania, since it's gaining stronger geopolitical leverage in the region, again, due to security concerns that arose with the Russian aggression in 2022, now they are feeling that they can criticize, or at least formulate their criticism in a higher tone than they do that before. This is element one. And element two in this, where the Romanian community is now being dissatisfied with the position in which they are, is the religious question. The religious policy in Ukraine also changed a little bit since 2014 due to the desire to decrease the Russian influence in the religious life. Since you know the majority of Ukrainians are Orthodox Christians, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is well, not leaning, but in the religious structure, it is close to the Moscow Patriarchate, right? And the new Patriarchate, which is formulated in Kiev after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, received its Tomos from Constantinople in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And there were certain projects to pivot all the Orthodox communities towards Kiev from Moscow. Well, in case of the Romanian community, this is a very tricky thing, but because if they have to leave their traditional denomination, they would rather join the Bucharest Patriarchate rather than Kiev, which is not a pleasant change in position if we are taking into account what the Ukrainian policies are and what the conditions in the Ukrainian, let's say, society are. It is a very deeply fractured society, and yet the military aggression and the invasion of the Russian armed forces against Ukraine created sort of crisis unity, I would say, but those differences and those fractures and cracks within the society are still very deep, and one of these are the religious matters, and as we can see, these are even above the ethnic groups, because Russian Orthodoxes, Ukrainian Orthodoxes, and Romanian Orthodoxes may be dissatisfied with the new policies on the same level. But regarding the communication level or the relations between the ethnic groups within Ukraine, mostly it works okay. Mostly it works fine, and then we also have to take into account that in many cases these ethnic groups are geographically separated from one another, so the possibilities of interactions are a little bit limited. So, for example, Hungarians from Transcarpathia barely meet Romanians from Bessarabia or even from Bukovina. But within villages or towns where the Romanians and Ukrainians are living together, like in the eastern parts of Transcarpathia, the inter-ethnic and interpersonal level of communication or relations is mostly good. So there are no ethnic-based conflicts between the minorities and like between Romanians and Hungarians, for example. There might be some tensions and disliking between the majority and the minority, but within the minorities, it's not that typical, not that much.
Thank you so much for that. I've just been looking at the clock, and I'm going to skip over some additional questions, I think, so that we have time for the audience questions. So I think we've covered a lot. I'd like to end with Dr. Ferenc on a very humanistic level. I know that you travel, I mean, Dr. Seremet does as well, but to Transcarpathia and in your new capacity, how have the people been coping with the effects of the war? What are the challenges they face as a whole in that region? So, apart from, minority issue, their ethnicity.
Thank you for that question. I think it's important to cover it also because Transcarpathia has become a territory which is a kind of a safe place within the Ukraine, and for that, lots of internal refugees came to that region, which actually and basically changed the ethnic situation within the territory. So it's around the number of these internally displaced persons within the country is around 600,000, and many in the region are facing poverty, otherwise, and energy shortages. and the challenges of supporting a growing population in need. So these are the key words of the situation right now, what the Transcarpathian Hungarians and also the Transcarpathian Ukrainians have to face. Otherwise, if I just focus my attention to the Hungarian minority, we see that lots of families are separated because maybe young people decided to leave their country, but the older one are still at home. So it's socially not the best case for the society, for the families, for the peoples, because they cannot move so easily like beforehand, before the war. Even families, even men and women are separated in cases, or even small children brought up without the fathers in the family being present. So this is not it. This is. We can say that this could be one of the hardest period of the Transcarpathian population, and not only the Hungarians but also the Ukrainians. So they need lots of support, and they need our supports. Yes.
Right. I understand how a lot of the humanitarian and infrastructure, including our own foundation, that's been provided, has been to other areas. But you make a very important point that they need this sort of assistance as well, as their local resources are strained. We have a question. Anyone put your questions into the chat so that my colleague can see them. We have a question to Dr. Ferenc. What kind of, as we talked about humanitarian assistance, but what kind of specific additional measures could the United States take to effectively support Ukraine, Transcarpathia, and ethnic minorities?
I think on the one hand, all these supports are crucially important, which we cannot list because we don't have enough time to mention all of them. The humanitarian aid and all of the international cooperation in helping those people in emergency situation in Ukraine. But I think I can say it on behalf of the whole Transcarpathian Hungarian community that the community's most or the biggest desire is to reach the peace in the territory, to return to that days when there were no tension between nationalities within Transcarpathia. So I think that this diplomacy work could be done. I think if we think about the big players of the ground like the United States.
Okay, I think there's another question coming in. I've been told, but I don't see it. There's one question. Let's see. This is addressed to both speakers. Could you please shed some light on the Russian minority? Are they participating in the discussions on minority issues regarding Ukraine's accession to the EU? I guess the question would be is that, are their needs being considered as part of the accession process. We'll want to tackle that. I'm not sure how this is going to work. We might get cut off in 2 minutes. I don't know if there's a timer on here. So which one of you would like to address that?
I'm just going to give a quick, short answer on that. Well, ideally, minority rights shouldn't be exclusive, meaning that if minority rights are being improved, then this should be applied for all of the minorities living in Ukraine. Of course, with the Russian minority and the Russian language in general, it is now a little bit so it is a heavy matter in Ukraine due to moral and political points of views as well, meaning that there is a significant well, there's a struggle to removing the Russian influence from Ukraine, and this influence must be removed from the political sphere, from the media, from the culture sphere as well. We all see the Pushkinopad, which means when the Pushkin statues are being removed from parks and cities. So if we take into account the current conditions that we know that they are not good between Russia and Ukraine, it is hard or a little bit illogical to force or to persuade the Ukrainians to rethink or rework their agenda here. Of course, as I mentioned, minority rights shouldn't be exclusive, but we also have to take into account what are the political realities in Ukraine, and we also have to take into account how the Ukrainian patriotic society will react to measures that can be taken towards the Russian minority, or the use of Russian languages, for example, in the public sphere or in education or media or whatever. So, yeah, it's a very complicated and very complex matter that is burdened not only with legal issues but also with political and moral elements as well, which are very important today in the Ukrainian society.
Dr. Ferenc, want to add anything to that?
I can also add that right now Ukraine think about the EU accession and the framework, the legislative framework. If the state is thinking about the minorities, which has the language of the European Union. So now this is the status quo. And I think I also can join to Mr. Seremet's opinion that it's not maybe not the right time to change this status quo because of the political reality.
I understand. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panelists. We've run out of time. I wanted to let everyone know two housekeeping measures. One, the recording of this will be up on our homepage probably tomorrow, and you'll all get a notice of it so that you can share it. And also, I wanted to remind everyone, draw everyone's attention. It hasn't been advertised yet, but we will be having our next discussion on December the 2nd, Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and that's going to be with Slovak investigative journalist Gabor Cimer, who's going to be talking about ethnic-based property confiscations in that country from ethnic Hungarians and Germans. So you'll be receiving notification about that over the weekend. Thank you very much for our panelists and for everyone attending, and we hope to have you back again soon, probably next year, for follow-up on how things have been.
Thank you. Thank you very much for you to organize this.
Thank you.